You got lots of friends? This morning, I found someone who is not my friend. His name is spelled S-C-A-L-E. Anybody meet Scale this morning and find out that y'all are not friends? Oh my goodness, I think it was 5 pounds since the last time I was visiting with him, and yikes. But it's been a great week. Did you have a good week with your family and friends, celebrating Thanksgiving and being with each other and being thankful? I hope you did. My week started off with a bang last Sunday. After a great day of worship, I got to visit with Catherine Reed last Sunday afternoon. And you may not be aware, but during one of our special prayer services, Catherine came forward and expressed a desire to join our church through baptism. So will you join me in rejoicing over Catherine's decision to join with our church family? We're looking at baptizing Catherine next Sunday, and it's going to be a continuation of a joy-filled celebration, just as the choir just led us in singing. And then also, what a scrumptious meal last Sunday evening. Did you enjoy that special time of Thanksgiving dinner together as a church family? I want to especially thank Tony Christmas and all those who helped. If you served or helped in the behind the scenes to decorate and all that, would you stand up so that we can say thank you to all that helped Miss Tony pull that together? Well done, team. Great job. Well, beginning today and going through the holiday season, I want to take some time to try to help keep me focused in the right direction, and hopefully it helps you as well. I don't know about you, but I went to the store on Friday and a little bit on Saturday, and I tell you, it's just so hectic. Anybody experience that? Trying to get all your decorations out, trying to get family together, trying to work out all the different social occasions that you have, buying all the gifts, all the rigmarole that you go through this holiday season. It's easy for me and possibly for you to get distracted from the reason that we have to celebrate and be thankful. And so starting today, I want us to walk through some Old Testament passages that were important to the gospel writer Matthew. And he quotes these different passages or refers to these different passages in the opening 2 chapters. And so we're going to do a verse-by-verse study over the next few weeks of chapters 1 and 2 of Matthew, looking specifically at some of the Old Testament implications that were extremely significant to Matthew. And today we do open it up to Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17. Now, how many of you recall ever hearing a sermon preached on Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17? Wow, I am impressed with all the hands. So many hands in the air. Well, today may be a first for you, but as Harold already mentioned in the children's message, I firmly believe that every single jot and tittle, every single I that's dotted and T that's crossed in the scriptures is significant, and I hope to illustrate that today in one of the lesser-known passages from Matthew's beloved gospel. Matthew chapter 1, we'll look at the first 17 verses. Anybody want to read it for me? All these names? Here we go. This is the record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, the descendant of David and of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam the father of Abijah. Abijah the father of Asa. Asa the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was the father of Jehoram. Jehoram was the father of Uzziah. Uzziah was the father of Jotham. Jotham was the father of Ahaz. Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh. Manasseh was the father of Ammon. Ammon was the father of Josiah. Josiah was the father of Jehoiachin and the brothers born at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the Babylonian exile, Jehoiakim was the father of Shealtiel. Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the father of Abud. Abud was the father of Eliakim. Eliakim was the father of Azor. Azor was the father of Zadok. Zadok was the father of Achim. Achim was the father of Eliud. Eliud was the father of Eleazar. Eleazar was the father of Matthan. Matthan the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary gave birth to Jesus, who is called the Messiah. All those listed above, including 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 from the Babylonian exile to the Messiah. Now you see why you haven't heard very many sermons from that passage, right? Thank you, Ryan. I read the story this week of Gideon Miller. Gideon was a Jew by birth, grew up in Judaism, and he developed a drinking problem in his young adult years, and he began to recognize the need to make changes in his lifestyle, and so he went and joined an Alcoholic Anonymous group that actually met in a church, much like our church houses an AA group and other support groups like it. He arrived early on one particular meeting date, and he had some time to spare. He was an avid reader, although he had never read the New Testament, and he saw one sitting on the table in the church where his AA meeting was about to meet. And so he reached over and he picked it up and he thought, I'll start at the very beginning. And so he started at the very beginning of the New Testament, and he came to the passage that we just read, and he came to a new revelation. He realized for the very first time, reading this genealogy that we just read, that Jesus was not a Christian, that Jesus was a Jew. He decided he would go out and read more about this Jesus, so after the AA meeting, he went to the local store and he bought a Bible, a New Testament Bible, and he continued to read through the stories about Jesus' life, and he eventually gave his heart and his soul to Jesus as the Messiah that had long been prophesied in Judaism, never having previously connected it, but having first been exposed to it through the genealogical lineage that's presented in these very verses. So I echo to you today that these verses are of extreme importance, not only to Judaism and to Christianity, but to you and I if we seek to unlock who Jesus is and why he came to be born. Matthew emphasizes two particular people in Jesus' genealogy, and we're going to look briefly at both of them. The first one is that Jesus is like Abraham. Jesus is likened unto Father Abraham. Now, if you look, both Matthew and Luke have genealogies in their Gospels. Matthew's occurs in Matthew chapter 1, Luke's occurs in Luke chapter 3. But these two Gospel writers were writing to entirely different audiences. Matthew, a Jew and a follower and disciple of Christ, sought to primarily reach the Jewish community with the good news. Luke, not a Jew, a Gentile, decided that he wanted to try to target the Gentile community with the gospel. So when you look at the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1 and you compare it to the genealogy in Luke chapter 3, there's some staunch contrasts. Most significantly is that Matthew makes a significant point to tie in Jesus' genealogy to Father Abraham, the father of the Jewish people, and to David, the great king over Israel. Conversely, since Luke's writing more to a non-Jewish audience, he writes and takes to the genealogy of Jesus all the way back to God creating God creating Adam. That God created Adam and Eve, and from Adam and Eve, all of humanity has its existence. And so we're all a part of the gospel message in Luke's mind, whereas in Matthew's context, he's specifically trying to target those who are born and raised in Judaism who don't have an understanding that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. Let me share with you another comparison. When Luke writes and encapsulates Jesus' teaching, he chooses to use an occasion in which Jesus spoke on a plain, a wide open field, symbolizing that the message and the teaching of Jesus is applicable to all people equally. But if you compare Luke chapter 6 and the teaching that Luke gives to Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, you'll see that in Matthew's gospel, Matthew chooses to emphasize Jesus not speaking on a plain, but on a mountainside. Because all throughout Judaism, mountains serve as tremendous places where God's people meet with their God. The giving of the Ten Commandments to Moses at Mount Sinai, the offering at Mount Carmel, the whispering of God to Elijah. Over and over and over again throughout Judaism, it's this coming together with God and his people that's illustrated. So is it any wonder that Matthew and Luke would take different angles to illustrate their point about Jesus' ancestry? Jesus, in Matthew's eyes, is like Abraham. He's from the lineage of Abraham. And you remember the story of Abraham. Abraham lived in Ur with his family. He, along with his household and his father Terah, traveled to Haran. And when they got to Haran, at some point his father Terah died. God came and spoke to Abraham, now the father of the family, and encouraged Abraham to leave what he knew to go to a place that he would show him. Traveling southward into the Canaanite territory, taking his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot, Abraham traveled down into the land that was occupied by foreigners, and God spoke to him and encouraged him that one day his lineage would occupy this very land. Later, Abraham had a son, as depicted in Matthew's genealogy, and his name was Isaac. God encouraged Abraham to take his one and only son up the mountainside and offer him on the sacrificial altar. When God saw that Abraham was willing to offer his very most prized possession, his only child, God stayed the knife. The angel turned Abraham's focus towards a ram caught in shrubbery, and that ram was offered in the place of his son. It is in that context of Genesis chapter 22 that God speaks these words to Abraham that bring to fulfillment in the time of Christ. Look at what Genesis chapter 22 verses 17 and 18 say. God to Abraham, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. You see, what God is telling Abraham is that you will have numerous descendants, not just one child, and that through those descendants, eventually you will touch and bless the world. This was the commission to Israel. Israel was chosen to be a lighthouse to the nations, and Jesus comes to be the fulfillment of that light to the world. Jesus is the means through which all nations on earth will be blessed because of the faith that Abraham exhibited towards God, and for those of us who follow in that same faith, our faith in God as well. In Jesus, the kingdom of God has become and will continue to become as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands on the seashore. Stop and think about the millions of people over the ages who have given their heart to Christ, and perhaps the millions more who will do so in the coming ages. We are grafted into the family tree of Abraham because Jesus came to extend an invitation for all of us to put our faith, as Abraham did, in his God and your God and mine. And so, as we are told in verse 17, Matthew lists 14 generations between Abraham and David. He mentions Abraham, his son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, Jacob, who had the 12 sons of Israel, specifically noted here, Judah, from which will come the royal ancestry, which will eventually lead to David. David's great-grandparents, Boaz and Ruth, Moabitess, and then Obed, Jesse, and of course, David. All of these connections are important historical roots for Judaism and validation that Jesus is like their father Abraham. But he doesn't stop there. In addition to identifying Jesus to be of the line of Abraham, he goes a second layer and he says he's also like David. Jesus is likened unto David in many ways. You recall the story of David in his childhood, out tending sheep. He was a shepherd by trade, raising the sheep of the flock of the family. When Samuel comes to try to identify God's anointed and to anoint the next king of Israel, he goes through all of David's older brothers and asks, is there anybody else? Finally, this young shepherd, who had been previously overlooked, is identified as the next future king of Israel. David grows up, and his life is certainly not without sin. It's even noted in the genealogy that Solomon is the son of Bathsheba, who is the widow of Uriah. And you remember that story well, as Uriah was killed at David's command in order to try to cover up the fact that he had an adulterous relationship with Uriah's wife, Bathsheba. And nevertheless, because David, when he messed up, he fessed up, he got things right with God, he confessed what he had done wrong and sought contrition and repentance, he's described in 1 Samuel 13:14 as a man after God's own heart. And in 2 Samuel 7 and elsewhere, God makes a covenantal promise to David that his heir will always rule on the throne of God's people. And so as you continue to look through these generations that follow from David all the way down to the exile, you'll see that all of this is the royal family line that matches the kings of Judah. There's actually 17 descendants of David, not 14. Matthew purposely, I would propose to you, omits 3 in the middle. So he lists 7 sons from Solomon down, all the way to Jehoram. He skips 3 on purpose, and then he lists 7 more to round it off to 14. The 3 that he leaves off are Ahaziah, Joash, and Amaziah, and they just happen to be the middle 3. Matthew is intentionally distorting the genealogy because he wants to match the numbers, and we'll see why in just a few minutes. Now, before you start crying heresy, let me let you in on a little secret. The Hebrew word that's translated father of throughout this passage actually means descendant of. It does not mean that there has to be a father to son direct connection. It could be a grandfather to a grandson, a great-grandfather to a great-grandson. It can be any kind of relationship that exists between parents or grandparents and so forth. But the intent is to show that they are in that line. Just like if you have someone that is removed in your family tree, but you want to tell them, you might speak of them as your ancestor, or you might speak of them as someone who is in your family line. That's all that's being said here. So Matthew purposely makes this adaptation to identify Jesus as the shepherd king. This shepherd king will come to be born in a manger, not a royal palace. He'll be born among sheep, not a royal family. This shepherd king will come and be born in a common family to relate to all people on the earth, not just those of the upper class. This shepherd will later in John 10 speak of himself as one who shepherds his sheep, not as the hired hand who when trouble comes flees, but as the shepherd who's willing to lay down his life for the protection and welfare of his sheep. It's this same shepherd king who will be hailed as king on Palm Sunday as branches are laid in the city streets and people proclaim him to be the Messiah come to bring liberation to God's people. And it will even be this shepherd king who will be accused and crucified with the sign of his crimes put over the cross that names him as he is King of the Jews. Jesus came to be like David. And Jeremiah, hundreds of years before, prophesied it this way: "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up from David's line a righteous branch, a king who will reign wisely and do what is just and right in the land." Jeremiah 23:5 and 6. The day's coming, Jeremiah says, when I'm going to raise up out of David's line a branch that will extend forth and demonstrate the righteousness of God to his people, who will reign with wisdom and do what is just and fair and equitable. That is who Jesus came to be. Jesus' family line is not without its own faux pas or downsizes of things that might not be as positive or noteworthy. And yet, here is the sinless Son of God who comes from a group of folks that at times maybe didn't bring honor to their family name. Maybe you can relate to that. It's been anonymously said that every family tree produces some lemons. Anybody got any lemons in your family tree? Some nuts. Anybody got any nuts in your family tree? And even a few bad apples. Anybody got any bad apples in your tree? If you don't, you might ought to look in the mirror because you might be a lemon, a nut, or a bad apple. We all have them. And Jesus had people like Rahab, David, Bathsheba, Ruth, people in his family tree that didn't always glimmer and shine, but ultimately pointed to one who is just like you and me. Jesus is like Abraham. Jesus is like David. And third and finally, I would suggest to you that as ironic as it would have been to hear in the first century, Jesus is like the exiles. In the third aspect of the genealogy, we see 14 generations listed from Abraham to David, 14 generations listed from David to the exile, and 14 generations listed from the exile to the time of Jesus' birth. And although we don't have historical records to verify, I think it's extremely likely that Matthew, as in the middle section here in this latter section, also distorts the genealogy a little bit to take out a few relationships just to match the same number 14. But he does pick up with Jehoiakim, who was the king in the time of the destruction of Babylon. He does speak later on of Zerubbabel, who, if you were here last Sunday, may recall, was the descendant of David in the time of the Second Temple, when Haggai and Zechariah encouraged the people to rebuild the temple. And we talked about that passage in Haggai chapter 1 last week. But again, it seems that Matthew is being very intentional to emphasize this number 14. Why? Why would he do that? Why wouldn't he just go ahead and list all the generations? I think that Matthew, again, writing to a Jewish audience, was not only writing what you read on the surface, but writing a cryptic message of extreme significance. Now, I could be wrong, but if you'll allow me a few minutes to pose a hypothesis, you can evaluate it later over lunch with your loved ones. In ancient Hebrew, in the first century, there were no vowel markings in the Hebrew language. It was only consonants. And if you go to that center section, you'll see, and oftentimes when you emphasize something, you put it in the middle. Certainly in any kind of chiastic type structure, you'll put the center point as your main point. And Matthew does that here. He speaks of David in that center section, right? He spoke of Abraham in the first, David in the middle, the exiles in the latter portion. So let's just take the name David, remove the vowel markings, even in English, and you're left with three consonants, right? A D, a V, and a D. Have you ever done a puzzle, maybe in the newspaper or maybe in one of these puzzle books, where you had lines for each letter, and underneath those lines was a number that reflected the number in the sequential order of the alphabet? Anybody ever done those? So like A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, D is 4. Well, let's do that. Let's just see what happens when we do that with the Hebrew alphabet, okay? So the first and last letter in David's name is a D, or in Hebrew it's a Dalet. So the Hebrew alphabet begins Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet. So that is number 4 in the Hebrew alphabet. So let's put a 4 under both of those D's, all right? If you continue in the Hebrew alphabet, the letter V doesn't occur near the end as it does in English. It actually occurs in the 6th position. Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav is the V in Hebrew. So let's put a 6 in that position. Now, if you add those three numbers together, what do you get? 4 plus 6 plus 4 equals 14. Is it possible that again, Matthew is intentional, not being lapsed, but purposely trying to emphasize the number 14 to draw it back to the person of David as the example or the epitome of who Jesus really has come to be. He is the shepherd king who comes to bring deliverance to his people. Is it perhaps even possible that Matthew is doing an intentional play on words with the meanings of the names of these great people? So let's just do that. Let's explore what the names of the great people emphasized are. So let's remove that screen and go to the screen with the names of the patriarch Abraham. You recall, Abraham means the father of many, or the father of a multitude. David's name means one who is beloved, the beloved one. The exiles, we know, speaks generally of the people who are removed from their homeland, who are pulled away, who are isolated, who are feeling alone and separated from God in his presence. And as Jack Shooter so oftentimes reminds us when he does the deacon prayer, Jesus means the salvation of Yahweh, the salvation of the Lord. Now let's take those and put them into a phrase, if you will. Could Matthew cryptically be saying something like, in Jesus, God, who is the Father of many, so loved, beloved, his exilic people, the world, that he gave his one and only Son, that if anyone would come to believe in this Jesus as Messiah, that they would have everlasting life. Now, if I'm right, and I may not be, that sounds strikingly similar to a verse we probably all know and love in John 3:16. But let me read with you John 3:16 and the subsequent verse, verse 17, and see if this might not be the theme that Matthew, even in a lineage and genealogy, is trying to emphasize to his Jewish audience. John writes, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him." Is it possible that John, writing his gospel perhaps a couple of decades after Matthew, knew the cryptic message of his predecessor and decided to proclaim it with boldness in the encounter between Jesus and Nicodemus? Is it possible that all four gospel accounts really teach one primary truth? That Jesus came not only to be like Abraham or David or the exiles, but Jesus came to be like you, to take on human flesh and dwell among us, to walk on the face of this earth amidst sinful temptations and yet never sin, so that he could die, so that you could be like him and you could live. The message is true. The message is real. The message is worth being mindful this Christmas season. I love the movie A Knight's Tale. Anybody ever seen that one? It tells the story of a young, totally inexperienced, totally lower class, no royal blood in him whatsoever, young squire named Ulrich. And Ulrich comes across a quite eloquent man, maybe even a liar, named Geoffrey Chaucer, who likes to put a positive spin on everything. And here is what he says as he pronounces Ulrich as a contestant in the jousting tournament to try to win over his hearers Think about it in the context of what we just saw about who Jesus is. I cannot look upon Lord Ulrich, for I weep to see his shining face. My Lord is a gift to your eyes, for we shall never ever see him like upon this earth again. I would list his lineage if it would serve to honor him. Most men here, it's sad but true, they look to their past to prove their worth. They look to their deeds of their fathers. No, Sir Ulrich has great ancestors, make no mistake about it. Sir Gerard von Rickbod, Sir Duke Gulif of Saxony, Sir Van Mich IV out of Brunswick. But these great, great men pale in insignificance next to him. I do not list them to honor him. I list him to honor them. Just listen to that last phrase again. Perhaps Matthew is saying, I do not list Jesus' ancestors to honor Jesus. I list Jesus to honor his ancestors. This holiday season, it's easy to get caught up in a lot of other things. But the one thing that is most important is to list Jesus in your heart and to let him have the lordship of your life. Pray with me. Father, at Christmas time especially, it's easy to get distracted, overwhelmed, and misled. It's easy to get caught up in the hustle of the circumstances and overlook the significance. And yet I thank you that Matthew has given us this reminder that Jesus, the sinless Son of God, came to earth to be like us, to be human, to struggle, to experience weakness and temptation, to at times be tempted to get caught up in the busyness or in trying to take care of everything or please everyone. And yet in his humanity, he walked in faithfulness with you. And so I pray for myself and for my friends gathered here that you would constantly over the next month draw our attention back that Jesus is the focal point, not only of the Christmas season, but of human history. Make us mindful of the Christ that we go to Mass, the Christ that we worship, the Christ who is the Messiah, Jesus, the Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. I know for a lot of folks, going back and looking at your ancestry is quite an interesting hobby. I hope you're able to do that to a certain extent and explore that together. It gives you a background on where you've come from. But let me remind you today, especially as we go into an invitation time, that your family's past does not reflect who you are as a person today. You are a child of God, who he loves unconditionally, who he sent Jesus to die for. All of us have struggles and dark spots in our personal past and our family past. And we can bring those to Christ, and he can wash them and make us white as snow and give us purpose. If you're here today and that just seems too good to be true, would you give me a few minutes of your time this morning before we leave so that I could help remind you that the truth is not set by our ability to interpret it, but it's true because God in his wisdom has said it. I would love the chance to pray with you and talk to you about how you could have a relationship with a God who truly loves you more than anything else in this world. Stand with me. God's speaking to you. I'll be here at the front, eager to pray with you and guide you through any decision that God might put on your heart today.